I will confess to being slightly more allergic to reporting on new polls than the average person who works in cable news. Generally, I think that polls are made to seem more important than they are most days in terms of predictive value for elections that are sometimes really far away, right? Far away in time. But at this point in the election, when we are less than 50 days out, and the playing field has narrowed for the presidency to few enough states that you do not need two full hands to count them, Now is the time to go ahead and look. Now is the time to actually be following these day by day. This week, earlier in the show, we have shown you a version of this map, the swing states and the maybe swing states in this election, along with what the current polling shows us about who is winning. We updated these numbers today, but with regard to who is ahead in these swing states and where, not much has changed. Mitt Romney still leads in one of these 9 states. In New Hampshire. And if you look at North Carolina, you can see Governor Romney had been ahead in North Carolina, but the latest poll out of North Carolina now shows the North Carolina race to be tied 46-46. But here's the other number you need to know about North Carolina right now. It is that one, 30,000. That's the number of voters who are on the North Carolina voting rolls that a self-appointed, supposedly nonpartisan Tea Party outfit has announced should be stripped from the rolls. 30,000 people. The Tea Party group says 30,000 people need to be dropped off the North Carolina voting rolls because this Tea Party group, has determined that those 30,000 voters are all dead people. And the group is therefore challenging those voter registrations now in North Carolina with the election less than 50 days away. A couple of weeks ago, this group, calling itself the Voter Integrity Project in North Carolina, delivered a list of almost 30,000 names to that state's Board of Elections. The group's leader said that 90% of the names on its list should be taken off the rolls for sure. And they handed those names to election officials. Now, they got tons of dramatic, great press when they did that. Here's one local TV station in North Carolina reporting, because this group told them so, that these 30,000 North Carolina voters on this list are dead. They say so.
Volunteers focused on finding dead voters say they have proof of the widespread problem across the state. Members from the Voter Integrity Project cross-reference data from the Public Health Department with registered voters. Of the state's 6 million voters, 30,000 are dead. Now, while it's a small percentage, the group's executive director says it has significant implications.
30,000 is a lot of people, considering the last presidential election was won by 14,000 or close to 15,000. So, yes, you look at it as a percentage, you go, so what? This is a minor number, but that's a lot of people that are on the roll, and any of them could have their identity stolen.
The group says it doesn't know how many of the 30,000 names were actually used to vote illegally yet. Next step, volunteers will match names with voting records.
Doesn't know how many of those names were used to vote illegally yet. Of the state's 6 million voters, 30,000 are dead. That's the press on the Voter Integrity Project in the swing state of North Carolina. But guess what? Those 30,000 people are not all dead, even if this Tea Party-affiliated Voter Integrity Project says they are. We know these people aren't dead because North Carolina officials started the laborious process of reviewing this list of allegedly dead voters last week. They winnowed the list down to 5,000 names that matched up enough for a second look, and they started sending out letters to those voters. And the results so far have been spectacular. Look at this. One voter, Carolyn Perry, has been voting in North Carolina since 1967. This month, she got a letter from her county board of elections saying she might not be qualified to vote anymore on account of she might be dead. She says, quote, "My initial reaction, I was mad as hell." Yes, understandably. Carolyn Perry's county is sending these "you might be dead" letters to 148 voters because of this kick the people off the voting rolls process that was started by a North Carolina Tea Party group. They've sent letters to these voters alleging that they are dead. And actually, already 42 of the people on the list have raised their living hands and said, hold on there a minute now. I do not appear to be dead, at least when I look at myself in the mirror. So far, North Carolina elections officials say they have found not a single instance, not one, of anybody on the Tea Party group's challenge list who has voted when they were not supposed to vote. So the press is saying, because this Tea Party group says so, that 30,000 of the voters in North Carolina, 30,000 of the votes in North Carolina were maybe cast in dead people's names, right? 30,000, massive fraud. The real number, at least so far, is 0. As for Carolyn Perry, she told the local press her theory on why she got challenged. She said, quote, "I'm a senior and I'm African American and I am not registered in the same party they are, most likely." Carolyn Perry, I should tell you, is a Democrat. So North Carolina started out with challenges to 30,000 registered voters. At last report, those challenges have revealed goose egg for an actual problem. 0 actual problem voters. Today, North Carolina officials told us they have put the suspect names through a rigorous series of checks, comparing the names to property records and birth registries and voter histories and death certificates. They have spent hundreds and hundreds of hours searching and researching. And they tell us this, quote, we have not found any instances of voter fraud. But the folks in North Carolina also told us this. They told us that election officials in the state essentially have 2 main responsibilities. The first responsibility is to make sure the voter rolls are correct. It is their civic duty, it's their charge to keep the rolls up to date. And that is why, for instance, North Carolina removes several tens of thousands of voters from the rolls every year because those voters are, in fact, dead. Those names get cleared from the rolls regularly as a matter of course. But the election board's second responsibility is to make sure the elections work right for the people who are on the rolls, starting with preventing eligible voters who ought to be able to vote without a problem from being blocked from doing that. The work of an elections board has real material consequences to all of us. If they do their job well, if they're able to devote sufficient time and resources and skill to the process of organizing an election, then the lines aren't too long. And there aren't too many frustrations about getting polling places open and machines working and stuff proceeding in a way that is well organized, that enough people are not dissuaded from voting by the difficulty of trying to vote itself, that the election outcome is affected by the difficulty of voting. And maybe the smooth running of the process of voting doesn't make a huge difference in the outcome in states when the result is a blowout. But in 2008, as you heard the Tea Party guy say, the election in North Carolina was decided by a teeny tiny margin of 14,000 votes. And with a margin that slim, and remember, the polls right now in North Carolina are straight up, a straight up tie. With a margin that tight, anything that makes it harder to vote in North Carolina could change the outcome in North Carolina and therefore could change the outcome of the presidential race. Anything that makes it harder, either because people are told they are dead when they are not, and then they have to prove otherwise, or because the process of lots of people having to go through that process, right, slows everything down for everybody else, or because the whole effort and attention to running the election has been diverted, right? So the elections board has had to spend hundreds of man-hours and lots of their finite resources on a giant make-work wild bullpucky chase instead of preparing for the election. Any of that could affect the election, right? So who is doing this? Who is essentially draining the resources of North Carolina elections officials in the weeks before the elections, making them chase this wild goose chase instead of doing their work? Who's doing this at this really critical time when we really need those elections workers to be doing their work? Who's doing it? Well, the Voter Integrity Project of North Carolina traces its roots back to the same vote-challenging machine that grew out of a Tea Party chapter in Houston, Texas. True the Vote, right? And this North Carolina version of the Tea Party group, True the Vote, is following the exact same playbook that they're following in other states. We have talked about it in swing state Ohio recently, for example, where the True the Vote Tea Party Voter Integrity Project thing there claims to have found over 700,000 voters in Ohio who they say should be stripped from the voter rolls now, before the November election. Similar Tea Party groups are doing the same thing, reportedly in parts of California and Illinois and in Arizona. But here is a thing to know about them in terms of who they are and how they represent themselves. This Voter Integrity Project in North Carolina, the one that said Carolyn Perry is dead and needs her name stripped off the voter rolls when she is very much alive and has been voting in that state for 45 years. This Voter Integrity Project that has submitted the names of 30,000 other North Carolina voters that they want stripped of their ability to vote. This group is characterized in the press in North Carolina as a nonpartisan nonprofit. And you can see why the press says that, because look, on the Voter Integrity Project's own website, quote, the Voter Integrity Project, VIP, is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization. We looked up this nonpartisan nonprofit Voter Integrity Project today on the North Carolina Secretary of State's website. That's where the state keeps the records on who is a nonprofit organization in the state. And look at what we found. This is the line for the Voter Integrity Project. They filed their papers on June 26th. Okay, so they're new. But see where it says BUS? That BUS is not short for autobus. It is short for business. They're not listed as a nonprofit. They're a business. We called the state to make sure we were not misreading this, and they said, no, you are reading that right. This Voter Integrity Project group, which calls itself a nonprofit and which is trying to get 30,000 North Carolina voters stripped off the rolls, they're calling themselves a nonprofit, but they are actually a business. Here are the incorporation papers for the Voter Integrity Project, complete with 200 shares of common stock, currently valued at nothing. After we asked the Voter Integrity Project why they described themselves to the state as a business, but they described themselves to the public as a nonprofit, they said it was an error. They said it was a mistake, and then they took the word nonprofit off their materials after we asked them about it. The reason it matters how this Tea Party group, this Voter Integrity Project, describes itself, and, in contrast, what it is, as opposed to how it describes itself. The reason it's important is that with nonprofits, their tax returns are public. So the law says you, ordinary you, can see any nonprofit's tax returns. You can discover who is funding them. You can discover how they are spending their money. You can discover who is in charge and what exactly they are up to as they try to kick 30,000 North Carolina voters off the voter rolls this soon before the election. Now that we know they're not a nonprofit, now that we know they're actually filed as a business despite what they maintain to the state, we may never know exactly what they're up to and who's funding them. Not now, not even next year, not even after the election, sometime later next year, right? When, frankly, it might be too late anyway to understand why they did what they did. Joining us now is Veronica DeGraffenried from the North Carolina State Board of Elections. Ms. DeGraffenried, thank you so much for your time tonight for helping us understand this.
Absolutely. Good evening, Rachel.
Good evening. I know that the issue of challenging votes and voter registration obviously comes with a lot of political and partisan implications. I also understand that your job is the epitome of nonpartisan. I want to make that very clear from the outset. I know you approach this from a totally nonpartisan perspective, but I have to ask you if this has happened before. In the past, have there been outside groups challenging tens of thousands of voter registrations in your state this close to an election?
No, this is a novel approach. Certainly, most voter challenges deal with residency issues, and we've never had a group come in before and challenge these number of voters at one time.
Now, obviously, you have to respond to these challenges now because they've been put forth to your office. What else would you and your office be doing if you were not devoting these resources and this time to poring over all of these tens of thousands of record? I mean, what's the usual work of your elections board in a big national contested election season?
Well, I mean, obviously, we're getting ready for the election, and we're still doing that. I mean, our county boards of elections, we have 100 counties in North Carolina, absolutely are getting absentee ballots out. People are already voting in North Carolina. We're sending our ballots out to our military and our overseas citizens, and we will continue to do that. Also, we're training our poll workers and just making sure that on Election Day, and early voting is going to be starting in a couple of weeks. So there are things that we have to do. We will continue to do those things. However, this process has used a lot of our resources, a lot of our time. But when we're presented with challenges to voters in North Carolina, we take that seriously. I think you mentioned at the start of your program that we have a dual responsibility. And that is to ensure that anyone who is not eligible and registered and qualified to vote, that they're removed. But we also need to ensure that people who are qualified remain a registered voter and that they are not improperly disenfranchised.
I think that's the part of this that seems so important to me, and it seems like it's of national significance. As you're saying, you've got this dual responsibility for ensuring the smooth running in the elections and also maintaining these voter rolls. But obviously, you and every other agency in the country has finite resources, and when you're asked to so dramatically upscale how you are dealing with one part of your responsibilities, you have to worry if the other parts of your responsibilities aren't suffering. Are you able to tap any new resources from the state or any additional resources to help you get your work done because of this extra work that's been put on you?
Unfortunately not. We have not. We have been dealing with this, for a couple of months now. So we think we're in pretty good shape, and we are at the point that we're kind of winding down the research, because what we found is that although the Voter Integrity Project used our statewide Department of Health and Human services records or NC Vital records.